Hello and welcome everyone to the first IESA chat show. And I have with someone who I absolutely adore, and the company also I am a big fan of. So I couldn't have been more grateful than this to have him in my first chat show. Ed, or Edward as we call him. Ed, welcome to the chat show and thank you for being a part of this.
Bro,
We
thanks, Deb.
Welcome. We intend to do this chat show mainly to talk about some of the research work that various firms does, and to talk about some of the reports that many consulting firm or think tanks release. And
Mm,
we talk about it here. We also talk about educationalist professors, which we'll bring into this chat show. So
of
once
course.
a month is what we have decided that we will do this. So welcome, Ed, and if you would like to introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, bro, thank you, Deb. Firstly, thank you to you and the IESA for the invite, especially for the inaugural IESA chat show. Hi, guys. My name is Edward Rackley, Ed Rackley. I'm head of energy storage at CRU. So my work primarily at the company is looking as a market analyst, predominantly looking at battery energy storage technologies. I've kind of got like 10 years research kind of experience, either kind of market analysis, consultancy, a little bit on fuel cells as well in my background. But I'm a kind of material scientist turned analyst is probably the best way to describe my background. But yeah, it's a pleasure to be involved on the show today.
Amazing. Thank you. So my first question to you is, while this decade looks like a decade of LFP, lithium ion, especially LFP, can you highlight the technological innovation happening in the lithium ion space and technologies beyond just lithium ion?
Yeah, of course. Happy to chat through that. As you said, the decade is kind of very dominated by lithium ion, predominantly lithium iron phosphate, LFP. The industry has kind of gone through quite a seismic shift to LFP in probably the last 4 years or so, both in kind of in grid storage and in also in EVs as well. So predominantly LFP is a chemistry. It's very well studied. It's been around since the mid 90s, but it's a effectively the structure at a kind of crystallographic level is like a cage, and it's very stable. So when you cycle, it kind of gives you longer cycle life and probably slightly lower energy density than some of the nickel-rich chemistries you'll see. But in battery storage, cycle life is a really important metric. So I think that's one of the major things to kind of a point to stick out there, especially for lithium ion. Um, and then when we're thinking about almost that 2 to 6 hour kind of domain that you mentioned, at the moment we think it's predominantly going to be lithium ion. We've seen a lot more kind of expansions to those 6 hour projects, predominantly in the Gulf states and also in Chile. But one of the reasons that's kind of driven LFP to kind of be in the market incumbent at the moment has been a kind of a huge amount of improvements in terms of packing active materials, how much energy you store in your 20-foot containers, via either larger cell capacities. We've got multiple graphs, I think, on LinkedIn showing that kind of view as well. And obviously thinking about optimizing around these 20-foot containers primarily.
Mm,
And we're kind of seeing longer cycle lives too. And then, as you've probably seen in the last month or so, or maybe 6 weeks, we've seen stacked containers as well. So the reason why they're moving to stacked containers is there's been kind of a balance you're striking between these 20-foot containers, packing them full of batteries, and effectively them getting too heavy to ship or to transport. So that's kind of been the balance is if you ship them in slightly smaller containers, slightly lighter containers in this case, you can get more energy density for the same kind of project footprint effectively. That's kind of been the major driver.
right. Interesting. But talking about LFP, we have seen multiple innovations with LFP also.
Mm,
Just the other day, I was reading about LMR, and your own analysis, CRU analysis tells about LMFP.
yes,
So how are these taking LFP closer to NMC, or
of
maybe
course.
how is it making it more attractive?
Yes, so with I'll cover the LMFP first, so the lithium manganese iron phosphate first. So the reason why you add manganese into that chemistry is you effectively get to increase your operating voltage, which gives you more storable energy predominantly. One of the challenges for LMFP, and probably where I'm probably more bearish of its place in the storage industry currently is that with the manganese added, you kind of lose a little bit of cycle life. So for EVs, LFP cycle life is ample, and LMFP will kind of give you that and give you competitiveness against the nickel-rich chemistries. When you're thinking about LMFP in storage, I think there's a challenge there in terms of effectively the electrolyte is slightly less, or it kind of dissolves that manganese out of your cathode, and that really impacts your overall cycle life. So I think I'm more bearish on the technology in storage, predominantly because I think that will slow down there. LMR, a very interesting one in that way. Lithium and manganese rich kind of chemistries as well. Um, One of the reasons why you use those technologies is that you're going to gain a large amount of energy density for your cells, so
Mm.
effectively being able to store more energy per charge. The issue there is also kind of an element of cycle life stability. I think it will probably be a slower uptake in storage predominantly and probably more likely for the mobility sectors of the market.
Interesting. And about the cell, we are talking today about 314, or maybe more than that.
Yep.
Where is this ampere hour going to go in another year or something?
So we've seen multiple announcements from manufacturers looking at 485 amp hours. There's a couple of Chinese manufacturers actually looking at over 1,000 amp hours as well.
Wow.
I think one of the, yeah, they're huge cells. We're talking probably that big. We're getting to that level. But I think one of the challenges is manufacturability. So 314 is kind of giving you containers roughly of 5 megawatt hours at the moment and
Mhm.
is widely kind of accepted as the kind of the market incumbent at the minute in terms of capacity.
Yeah.
Those 585 cells and onwards that we already mentioned, the challenge there is that 314 and kind of scaling to, we've seen some companies go to 392 as well. And 392 is just effectively editing current lines and keeping that 314 kind of scale up, right? But the 585s are like fresh new production lines needed to be effectively installed. Obviously, that takes time. Obviously, depending around the world, it really depends on how long that project timeline will be as well.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe in China, you'd be looking at less than a year to get those kind of fabrication lines online, but around the rest of the world, it's probably closer to 2 years as well, just for permitting, technical expertise, and kind of being able to build that as well. But I think there's kind of a little bit of a split between how the market will evolve. I think
Mhm.
next year it'll still likely be the 314 will be the market kind of majority, but I think
Okay.
585 will come in probably closer to late 26, early 27.
Interesting. Now, what is the disadvantage if you have to point out one? What is the disadvantage of bigger cells?
So I think one of the issues that's not really discussed very much by OC with all the product announcements is when you're cycling these batteries, right? You'll generate heat and you've got effectively thermal gradients form across your batteries, right?
Mm.
And if you have like a thermal gradient between 5 and 10 degrees across like two sides of a cell, you can lose up to probably 10 to 20% active cycle life effectively from just having that exist on your battery during operation.
Mm.
So I think the larger and larger these cells get, I think the issue is those gradients will form, and you'll likely have hot spots predominantly in the middle of your cell, which is very, very hard to cool. And I think
Yeah.
that will really impact kind of the continued growth that we've seen in these cells so far.
Interesting. That means larger cooling load and resulting in higher auxiliary consumption.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm. Okay. Now, batteries and the discussion, I mean, cost is just the topic that everyone wants to discuss on. So my
Yep.
next question is on cost. Cost is a parameter which keeps analysts across the globe on their toes.
Yep.
You define on one cost and the next day the cost changes. With a 40% drop last year, the lithium ion
Mm.
cells today is around 40 to 45 USD per kilowatt hour. How do you see this shaping out in the coming years? Do we see an
Mm.
uptick in the curve?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And as you mentioned, it's a cell level kind of price that we've seen around kind of multiple sources around the market. We're expecting a slight uptick potentially near the end of the decade. One of the reasons predominantly is that the lithium market supply balance we're expecting to slightly tighten by the end of the decade, and that may raise prices for cells.
Mm.
I think I will temper that answer with a couple of points.
Yeah.
Predominantly, we talked about we've kind of gone through this. We view the industry in kind of two major kind of transitions. We have cost reduction, which is predominantly economies of scale, effectively going from effectively kilos or tons worth of manufacturing to thousands of tons worth of manufacturing for materials. And obviously, talking about giga to almost terawatt hour scale for global cell manufacturing. So we've kind of seen that cost reduction come down the curve, right? But if you think of dollars per kilowatt hour as your metric, that's the dollars effectively being reduced. You can't keep reducing costs there. You will effectively get to a point where you reach a graveyard where the industry isn't profitable, where you will
Mm,
struggle to keep manufacturers kind of involved, or manufacturers will have to exit the market due to effectively a huge amount of price competition. So what we think will temper this as well will be technology improvements. So that's kind of talking about increasing kilowatt hours, the amount of energy you store.
mm,
So I think that's the thing is that we expect there will be a slight uptick on the pricing that you see today into the future, predominantly from that materials price rise. But I will hasten to fact, I don't think we'll see lithium price rises anywhere near what we saw at the end of 2022, where we kind of had I describe it as almost a chicken or an egg scenario where lithium's always been very, very cheap. Demand's always been quite stable. There's not been really much need to invest and increase supply. We've got a lot of demand and the supply isn't catching up. And that was kind of the chase that we had almost with the prices going up very much at that period. I think other technologies such as sodium ion as well will scale. And I think that will also kind of temper the kind of demand requirements for lithium ion as well. And I think will keep prices in check.
interesting. You mentioned sodium ion, so I kept the question for later, but I will ask
Of
him.
course.
So, do you do you? I mean, by we anticipate by 2030 sodium ion taking around 10% of the market share, and that also predominantly LFP's market share. It is not touching NMC's market share.
Yep.
Do you see sodium ion competing with lithium ion cost metrics perspective?
Yeah, so at the moment, we expect it to be cost competitive probably early next decade. This decade, it's going to be quite tight. I think that
Yeah.
price rise that we're expecting at the end of the decade will kind of give it a chance.
Mm,
Um, but I think predominantly there are things with sodium ion that we need scalability on the hard carbon kind of anode side of things to kind of make things bill of materials cheaper. And I think the technology as a whole will suffer slightly on terms of energy density. So like how
mm,
much energy you store per cell, it's slightly less volumetrically efficient as well. So I think that's one of the kind of the major challenges. Can these sodium ion systems kind of scale up that energy density? On paper, they should have a similar energy density to LFP when fully optimized, so that will help.
okay.
But
Okay.
it's kind of getting the optimization phase done at the moment, I think, is the challenge for the sodium ion producers.
Hmm. So the question which everyone loves, this cost of $45 per kilowatt hour,
Yep.
where do you see this bottoming out?
So I think from some of our or I would almost describe as theoretical modeling with really, really cheap, cheapest chips lithium, the highest scale kind of components that you'll be able to get to. I think we'd seen a cost. So this is cost, not price. So probably price is maybe $30 per kilowatt hour, but cost
Wow.
floor maybe $25 per kilowatt hour. So I think
Wow.
that's yeah, there's still some I guessing some innovations to kind of get to that point.
Yeah.
That's our view and our kind of yeah target at the moment from what we've seen in the market outreach as well.
Hmm. And in terms of energy density, do you see massive changes?
Or for LFP, that's a good question. At the moment, best performing LFP we've seen is roughly 200 watts per kilo. I think we'd
Okay.
expect maybe 220, but we're starting to get to the point where you need to add more dopants. That's
Hmm.
LMFP 240
Hmm.
and onwards.
Yeah.
I think LFP is kind of reaching its energy density kind of limits as pure LFP, probably the best way to describe that. But
Okay.
it's a really interesting challenge in terms of how that technology will evolve.
Just to compare this with sodium ion,
Yep.
where do we see that sodium ion's energy density?
So at the moment, I think some of the higher energy density sodium ion you'll see going into vehicles is probably close to 160, 150 to 160.
Okay.
In storage, maybe about
Mm,
120. So much lower, but the trade-off you have is that there's a compromise between energy density and cycle life. So some of those
mm,
sodium systems actually are getting quite competitive with LFP in terms of
yeah,
cycle life, but they just don't store as much energy.
understood. I was just going through IES critical mineral report, and it
Mm,
says so. The one thing that people talk to about sodium ion, that okay, this is a technology which is much more diverse, and
mm,
we can do it. But IES critical mineral report talks about that the value chain has already been captured by one country,
yep.
and we are late in the game.
Yes.
So yeah, okay. Do you feel the same?
Yeah, well, I'm guessing one of the interesting things here is that we're talking predominantly about China being one of the engine rooms of their kind of storage, battery
Mm,
kind of supply chain, and
yeah.
also for the upstream materials.
Mm,
It's no accident. The country's been kind of working on this for probably the last 20 years in terms of different types of policy and kind of investments in the supply chain.
mm,
I think the challenge and the reason why like we're almost thinking about energy security and whether there'll be ways to kind of diversify supply chains.
yeah.
I think there's kind of a couple of things with energy security. First point I'll mention is that renewables and kind of the transition that we're seeing globally, they are inherently intermittent. We need ways to store that energy and release the energy. Batteries offers a really good opportunity there, but we're seeing a lot more kind of, I guessing, awareness of that topic as well. Like obviously
Mm,
mainland Europe, we had issues with the Iberian blackout, kind of the end of April, kind of already highlighted vulnerabilities in that grid
yeah.
already.
Yeah.
But I think when you're thinking about diversifying a supply chain, I'm optimistic that it can happen. It will take, obviously, it will take time, and patience is sometimes a virtue, especially when you're thinking about investors. But I think one of the things I'll note here is that it doesn't have to just be primary materials for that upstream. Thinking about recycling and secondary materials and where those bases will be will also be
Yeah.
very important, kind of moving to that end of the decade at the moment.
Mm,
And I also think I would also mention that drivers such as price can also help expand this. It certainly happened that li the lithium market example I mentioned two
yeah.
years ago.
Yeah.
But I think one of the key points here is to kind of how you look at building a permitting and funding kind of frameworks, but also like incentives to kind of help explore that view.
Mm,
And I think one of the things that China has done particularly well is that it's not just the lithium ion or the sodium ions of the world that it's been scaling. It will try every single technology and see
yes.
what it can actually find a technical niche for. And I
Yeah.
think that's something where funding and kind of the patience and kind of educating investors as well is really important to kind of nurture developments in energy storage technologies all over the world, really.
Interesting. You talked about energy security. In the same report, it talks about 90% of processing power is captured by China itself.
Mm.
Now, with this, do you think that energy security remains a relevant discussion?
Yes, I think so. I think there needs to be some kind of diversification. And also whether that's been done, diversification doesn't have to be just by supply chain, it can also be by technology and then changing the supply chain around. So I think that's where sodium ion does come in
Hmm,
into kind of the view as well. I know, for example, like there's a lot of fly ash and kind of hard carbon like precursor sources around the world, which will help kind of, I guess, in globalize that supply chain is the best way to describe it.
interesting. Interesting. And just news for 2 days back that China is putting bans on rare earth materials. How do you see this? How will this impact?
I think it's a really interesting question in terms of that ban at the moment. I think they're still working on some licenses and how that will be agreed around the world. Again, it kind of highlights the issue of security here,
Hmm,
um, and the ability to effectively it's the upstream processing, which has been kind of one of the major, I guess, major supply chain bottlenecks and points to think about. And I
yeah.
think when governments kind of design frameworks, or you've got like the EU kind of looking at that as well, how you kind of incentivize investments in that part of the supply chain and working out how to diversify. I think the rare earth point is a really good example in terms of they're really important elements for all types of things in mobility and obviously looking in kind of uh, computing as well. So I think there's a big challenge there for sure.
Interesting. So we have been discussing this, that policies and regulations plays a very important role in how you see the sector grow.
Yep.
If you have been analyzing various markets, Europe, US, China, what do you feel about this policies and regulations?
It's a really interesting thing in terms of we can talk costs, we can talk technology, but there's a lot of the policy really does kind of blend and kind of touch all of those kind of points. I'll take a couple of examples here actually in terms
Yeah.
of how policy and regulations have kind of built the storage supply chain and deployment around the world. I'll start with China actually. So one of the reasons we spent most of this kind of conversation talking about lithium iron phosphate is that China effectively had looked to mandate storage for co-located applications, looking at predominantly solar and wind, actually quite a lot of wind. But it would also looked at banning the nickel-rich chemistries, the NMC chemistries in storage applications, predominantly
Okay.
on safety concerns. So that was one of the things in 2021 where LFP had kind of taken its technological evolution up to the point where obviously the BYD blade is a kind of a classic example. But it was kind of a blend where you've almost got a perfect storm there, where you've got a technology which is long cycle life, acceptable energy density, ready to go. You've got a slightly more energy dense, less safe technology you want to swap, and you've effectively restricted the ability of that technology's and chemistry's ability to grow in your domestic market, which is obviously very, very large. And that's really kind of combined together to build out this kind of LFP supply chain and growth that we've seen kind of in China and across the world.
Hmm.
And I think I'll use a couple other examples here because it's a really interesting point. Um, the Inflation Reduction Act from the US has also kind of really incentivized lots of utility scale demand and in
Hmm.
deployments. So last year the US had roughly installed 40 gigawatt hours worth of storage, and that's predominantly due to production tax credits and manufacturing tax credits to kind of accelerate that view, but predominantly production tax credits for those developers. So I think that's a really, really important side of things. Obviously, you've got policy as well. Like, policy and tariffs is also something that's
Yeah.
come up in terms of the US and how that will impact the US's kind of domestic market going out into the kind of at the end of the decade as well. I think we're starting to see a downgrade predominantly due to issues with that funding, that 30% investment tax credit being slowly phased out in 2028 as well.
Hmm.
I think that really impacts stuff, but I think that's been one of the interesting things. It's a blend of maybe potential mandates, maybe funding, but also whether you've got access to these kind of devices and these batteries to actually grow your market or have signed significant supply deals. So I think that's been a really interesting kind of blend of how policy and regulations have kind of examples of kind of grown the BES market in different parts of the world.
Interesting. And so basically, if you know how India is doing it, so one way of doing it, and this just came today,
Mm,
and that's why it's fresh in my mind,
mm,
that it has been providing capex support
yep,
for standalone projects. Initially, it was 30%, now it's 16%, and to build a portfolio of 30 gigawatt hours. That's huge.
yep,
Now, we have been a market which has been utilizing BESS for 2 cycles. And this is rare. When I look into projects globally, we find that a
mm,
single cycle or 1.5 cycle at the max is being
yep,
used, but we find it 2 cycles for 2 hours, and that for 12 years.
yep.
That's how the contracts are designed. Uh, if I place you there and talk about a bit about how have you seen best deployments across the globe?
In terms of the amount of hours duration,
Yes,
is that you're talking
yes,
about?
yes,
I
yeah.
see. So predominantly we've seen a lot more 2 hours is kind of the global average maybe two years ago
Mm,
potentially. But we've seen kind of a onus on on building around 4 hours at the moment for a lot of regions. Obviously not in the UK. 4 hours would be pointless. Wouldn't have enough solar generation in the winter to really cover that.
Okay.
But yeah, we've seen a lot more onus about 4 hours. Some of the technology and some of the manufacturers are starting to try and develop cells that are optimized around that 4 hour view as well. So yeah, we've seen a huge amount of shift there, predominantly where especially if you've got co-located batteries predominantly as well. So if it's solar and storage, 4 hours seems to be where the industry seems to be moving. We've seen a lot as well in South America and Chile. Some of their durations are kind of going to 5 to 6 hours at the moment for some of the projects being announced.
Mm,
And that's kind of the balance of effectively a very high utilization factor for the solar and kind of wind assets in that country. So it really depends on country, what kind of renewables mix you have, what your project is acting to being installed to do. But
yeah.
yeah, we're seeing a lot more kind of onus and funding to kind of stretch to probably around 4 hours at the moment.
And in terms of cycle life, do you see uh, we are currently discussing around 10,000 or uptick of 12,000 cycles, but
Hmm.
what is the cycle life today?
So I think we've seen very similar. I think it's been between 12,000, some manufacturers and some warranties kind of looking or investigating around the 15,000 cycle mark at the moment. So we are seeing, yeah, development there in terms of that available cycle life.
Mm,
But I think a lot of that 15,000 cycles I've seen has been predominantly either the 1 or 1.5 cycles per day view. So I think when you're looking at two, you're probably more
mm,
likely going to see a little bit of a reduction there.
yeah. Okay. Okay. That brings me to this question on
Mm,
long duration energy storage. That the thought process was okay till 4 hours lithium ion and thereafter some other technologies. But we have seen lithium ion winning in Australia an 8-hour tender, a competitive bidding tender.
mm, mm.
So, what is that limit about on lithium ion today on
Yes,
duration?
of course. So I think on terms of duration, I think we'd seen probably between that kind of 2 hour view that we've already talked about and closer to probably 8 to 10 hours being predominantly where lithium ion could sit.
Mm,
I think there's a really interesting question in terms of where you define long duration storage. I think if you talk around pretty much everyone I talk to in the industry has a different definition on where that long duration kind of overlap or that line
right.
gets kind of drawn. And I think that makes it very difficult for investment and investors kind of going in, or even like funding schemes, is because where do you draw the line at where your storage technology can kind of compete and where short and long duration kind of where that divide sits.
Mm,
Um, Obviously we've had lots of long duration storage being installed around the world. I'd say pumped hydro energy storage is kind of a
yeah.
predominant
Yeah.
technology, I guess in quite abundant in terms of, and kind of a proven commercial case. I think the challenge is it's very geographically limited,
Mm,
and will not work in every part of the world, especially in landlocked countries. Um, so I think that's kind of what some of the challenges there. But I also think that the when you're thinking about long duration storage, or you're thinking about investments or projects on that side of things you've got to think about here is that your asset is depreciating much slower than a short duration asset. So when we
mm,
think of long duration storage, we're thinking intraday, so anything past like a day kind of cycling.
yeah.
Um, and you've got to think about the fact that some of these technologies, the round trip efficiency isn't particularly high either, maybe close to 50% for some of like the form energy kind of examples of the world that you'll see. And so you're thinking about you have to depreciate your asset. Let's say you only use the asset once every 4 days, for example. So quite a very like long use case, right?
Okay.
Then you're having to depreciate your system with 90 cycles maximum in a year. It probably is less than that. And if it's
Mm,
50% efficient, you're kind of realizing that you're having to almost the initial kind of investment for your system has to get very cheap. Like you're halving it there. You have to make sure you've got enough energy at the time you need to discharge it.
mm,
I think that's some of the challenges there is for long duration is that the use cases aren't always well defined,
yeah.
but also that, yeah, it's been a hard kind of battle where a lot of the short duration technologies, particularly lithium ion and sodium ion, we're seeing a lot more uptake for those because I think they're probably better known in the market as well.
And vanadium flow?
Yeah, really good question. Vanadium flow is really interesting. At the moment, it still remains quite an expensive option to
Mm,
install. So I think we'd seen some bids in the around the world kind of close to $300 per kilowatt hour. Just to put this in context, I think in China you'll have seen some announcements at $65 per kilowatt hour for some systems. We've seen some at 60 in the last couple of months as well. So there's a big kind of capex trajectory
mm,
there for VRFBs at the minute. And one of the things we mentioned as well, supply chain security. Vanadium as potentially as a metal and as a market is particularly volatile. I think in 2019, as an example, a lot of vanadium comes from like global steel scrap, as an example. But there was a steel refinery in South Africa that went bust in 2019. It turned out it was 20% of the world's vanadium supply. So vanadium prices shot up overnight, predominantly from that issue with a lot of supply chain and supply kind of not meeting demand.
mm,
So I think there will have to be probably other flow battery technologies that will need to come in to kind of maybe the iron flow, iron chromium, or even spent lead acid as
yeah,
an example. I have a couple of friends working on startups in that space too, as kind of to kind of lower that initial capex for those technologies.
interesting. So, in the near future, if I keep aside pumped hydro,
Mm.
which is a mature technology, of course, and if
Yep.
I keep aside sodium ion and vanadium flow,
Yep.
is there any tech where you place your bet on?
Ooh, good question. I think I've seen a lot more on like zinc bromide and then zinc ion batteries as other options as well on the long duration side. They are kind of extending their cycle life, and I think will be very, very we'll think have a potential to be competitive, I think, in the market at
Hmm,
the moment. But yeah, great question.
okay, interesting. So, I have done with my questions, and
Yeah. Thanks,
I
Dev.
s- I see that there are some questions, and
Mm.
people, if you all can, of course, type in your questions in the Q&A box. Shivang Shah
Yep,
asks that will LMR replace LFP? Is there a case study for that? LMR replacing LFP?
of course. Um, I think it's predominantly more likely to take market share in mobility than in grid storage. And I think, as mentioned, I think it's kind of cycle life stability,
Hmm,
which will really impact LMR's kind of market share in kind of storage predominantly.
yeah. I think yes. One, you talked about e-mobility, and
Mm,
what now there is enough discussion that EVs did not grow to what the projections were, and that's why this overcapacity has happened, etc.,
yep,
etc. But this year we see that EVs are growing quite well.
yeah,
Of
of
course, it is dependent on which country you're looking into.
course.
But do you see that EV growth is rebounding?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more kind of growth in EVs. We've seen a lot actually in Europe actually from or at least one of my colleagues, David, who covers the EV market, has talked about a lot of growth there as well. But yeah, we're seeing a kind of a rebound at the moment. I think there was some uncertainty, and I think in the US as well, there's been the kind of slow removal of those kind of credits as well for those purchases. So
Hmm,
I think there's been kind of an element of yeah, maybe a weaker than expected EV market and some kind of oversubscription in terms of the production of cells and systems as well.
okay. And just one more question on so do you see the recycling market picking up?
Yes, I think the recycling market will pick up. I think one of the challenges in the kind of the last couple of years or so is there hasn't been a huge amount of scrap available to those recyclers. Best way to describe it, almost over-engineered the problem. One of the things you'll see is that a lot of these EVs that you'll see nowadays, you're probably talking about 8 to 12 years worth of operating life, for
Yeah.
example, being one of the major kind of feedstocks, right? Outside of Gigafactory scrap. And
Mm,
that's the thing is you're thinking about like the early Nissan Leaf as well. being almost what 2015, 2014, those would likely be going into recycling today. And some of
Mm.
those chemistries are not the same as what's being used now. So I think there's a balance of the feedstock that we're getting isn't the feedstock that we particularly require. It'll probably need extra steps, become more and more expensive to kind of purify to the right kind of components. Um, and I think that will be something over time we'll see a lot more kind of more relevant chemistries coming into the feedstock, and that will help improve I think the kind of profitability view for the recyclers as well.
Interesting. And does it become profitable?
I think it really depends on the chemistry. If you've got nickel-rich chemistries, definitely because you've got access to transition metals that help kind of offset some of that early cost. I think it will need some kind of policy intervention to help kind of or to help build that profitability view in terms of how much percentage recycled material you need in future batteries, for example. I think there'll be a way to kind of incentivize that as well.
Cool. Uh, there's a question about how will China impact LFP's price?
Oh, okay, great question. So one of the reasons I think was mentioned in some of the other Q&A parts as well was that the reason why we've had such a I guessing such a huge drop in the sell price at the moment, as you already mentioned, it's been predominantly due to oversupply in the Chinese midstream. So we're talking the
Mm,
cathode producers and the cell producers. This isn't just a kind of, it's not just a symptom of the fact that we had slower EV demand has kind of meant we've had more cells kind of sitting around. I think China had last year had kind of overproduced by closer to maybe 30% over capacity in comparison to global demand without
mm,
irrespective. So there was always going to be a lot of cells available for different applications. I think that's been one of the major challenges. And at the moment, as we already mentioned, China does dominate that supply chain, especially for LFP, having optimized the technology for the last 15 years. And I
right.
think that's been one of the reasons why it's kind of put such a dominant marker in the market so far.
Mm. One more question. Okay. If any company manufactures battery for grid storage, how
Hmm.
does it define the C rate? 0.5 C or 1 C?
So I think it really depends on the use case and what will happen is a lot of these projects go out to tender, and the
Mm,
tender will kind of explain how aggressively or what C rate it wants to be using its cells for. And obviously that is also limited for how many cycles you're doing a day
right.
uh, as well. So I think that's kind of linked to the warranty and then linked to the contract that you will sign with your integrator or your BESS manufacturer.
Right. Right. Abhishek has a question on RTC, that is round the clock power.
Yeah.
Abhishek, this is very India centric
Yes.
about how you will come, what is the perfect mix of wind, solar, and batteries. Uh,
Oh, fantastic.
yeah. So
Well,
this is,
that's a toughie for Abhishek. Abhishek, one of those things, maybe follow up with me afterwards on this side. So we have a separate service, which actually I'm not an author for at Crew, which is the power transition service where we look at grid mixes and like what might be optimal. So I think we might be able to answer that, but I don't feel particularly qualified to answer that from my side of things. But it's a great
yeah.
question.
Last but not the least, Edward, tell us a bit more about the services about of CRU.
Of course, yeah, happy to talk through that. So we effectively cover the supply chain from upstream to kind of downstream applications for predominantly at the moment lithium-ion batteries and obviously sodium-ion. So we have raw materials outlooks. Like if you're looking at the lithium market, the lithium market outlook, battery and raw materials outlook, nickel and cobalt outlooks. And then if you're looking at more like you want to see a strategy kind of view of the entire industry, kind of bird's eye view, we have a battery value chain service, which looks at both mobility and storage.
Mm,
And then finally as well, a couple of things. We have a bottom-up cost model. So anyone who's manufacturing cells and wants a view in terms of how to benchmark their cells against other regions, or wants to see what maybe their cells would look like at giga scale, we have a bottom-up cost model. Um, which is really, really useful for that kind of stuff for gigascale manufacturing. And then finally, if you want a deeper dive, the work that I do is normally always published quarterly in the eStack Energy Storage Technology and Cost Service. But that looks a lot at technology, a lot of the drivers around why we've got the technology and the cost kind of outlook out to 2030 at the moment.
Nice. And I would love to invite you to, so we are prepping up for India Energy Storage Week, that is from 8th to 10th of July. And we would love to invite you to India Energy Storage Week, that is in Delhi, to be a part of this podium. We celebrate energy storage in all of its form uh, through the 3 days.
Oh, sounds great. Sounds great.
Yeah,
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what we can do.
sure.
See what the calendar looks like. Yeah. So
Aditya has one question. How best helping sustainable and clean energy? Aditya, you can answer that. But yes, Ed, over to you. How is BESS a proponent towards sustainable and clean energy?
I think one of the major things here is that the with renewables predominantly and storage like BESS, the issue with renewables at the moment is that they're very intermittent. So if you've got like a solar PV array and farm, you're likely generating the energy between midday and let's say 3 p.m. in a day, like the afternoon effectively. And that's useful that you've generated it from a renewable source and obviously using the sun to generate that, right? But the issue is that a lot of demand, as you'll imagine, and kind of came up with the grid question earlier, is let's say in the evening or early morning, predominantly for especially when you're thinking about grid operators and residential.
Yeah.
So you need a way to kind of time shift that energy, that renewable energy that you've generated, that you've not needed to effectively use fossil fuels to generate. You need to find a way to effectively distribute that to the grid and effectively discharge the grid at the right time. And that's kind of where the batteries come in. And that's I guess, in their key USP in the market.
Thank you. Thank
No
you for
worries.
being such a sport and then coming up to this first chat show. I
No worries, Dave.
hope
It was a pleasure.
I hope you found it useful. And thank you. And we will continue these kind of discussions in future. If you have any feedbacks, let us know to make it better. Thank you. Thank you so much.